Hello and welcome to this edition of New Humanum. My guest today is Peter Hitchens, a man I've spoken to before on this channel. There were one or two points that he made in the last conversation we had which I wanted to take further with him. So I met him at the village of Binsey near Oxford, where we went for a walk and we began talking about history. So Peter, I heard you debating a couple of weeks ago, you were debating about the right side of history. And do you think there is such a thing as the right side of history?
No, it's one of the many Marxist attempts to find a substitute for God by personalising, giving a personality to something which doesn't have one, and therefore giving it the ability to judge between right and wrong. It simply isn't the sort of thing that can judge between right and wrong any more than a tree is. It doesn't have that capacity. But people all want to have a source of right and wrong. So if they are atheist materialists, then giving the name history to it is a way of getting around the problem of being atheist materialists while still having an eternal judge.
Like you, I regret the fact I didn't read history when I was a young man, because it seems to me to be a subject which explains who we are and where we've come from, and without that you can hardly make sense of life.
I also feel much happier in the past than I do in the present. I enjoy it there. You know what's going to happen. You know what people are really like rather than what they appear to be like. It's a lovely, safe place to be. It's nearly as nice as a sort of a happy novel.
I mean, some of your recent work.
Work, he calls it. Yeah.
Well, you know the book about the Second World War, the phony victory.
Phony victory.
Yeah, and that era of history, from the First World War through to the end of the Second World War, is a period that you've made quite an intensive study of.
Well, it's partly because there's so much fuss made about modern wars, and almost all of that fuss takes the shape of references to and direct comparisons with, particularly the Second World War. And I found these galling anyway, because they tended to be misleading in themselves. But the more I looked at them, the more I thought that the references to the past were actually mistaken as well. That they weren't just misusing the past; they were misrepresenting it.
In what way? I mean,
well, the whole nature of the outbreak of the Second World War is misrepresented. How long have you got? But we've created a scripture of the Second World War in which it was fought entirely as an act of principle.
I mean, nations are always involved, are they not, in myth making about themselves? You have to have national myths.
You have to have national myths, and almost all history begins with myth. And as a child, you absorb it as myth. It's the law of your tribe. It helps you work out who you are.
Isn't that what's happened
with
the
Second
World War?
When you become a man, you put away childish things, and you have to look at these things in a more serious fashion, especially when you're a person with a vote or influence in a society which goes with extraordinary frequency to war, and which seems in some cases actually to like war.
Of course, you don't vote.
Well, it wouldn't make any difference if I did. But I do have a platform.
You do. So here we are standing at the Holy Well in the
Treacle Well.
The Treacle Well. So this actually features in the Alice books, doesn't it? But this has been a holy well for centuries.
Oh yes, and it was particularly renowned for the ability to cure blindness. Hence, I think isn't the Freiswide myth about a cure for blindness?
Is that right?
I think so. Somebody goes blind and only recovers their sight when they go to the Holy Well. It's all too vague. I haven't done my homework on it.
This churchyard of St. Margaret of Antioch in Binsey, it's a very It's a very peaceful and special kind of place, isn't
Well,
it?
it's numinous, but it has the problem of so much of Oxford is it's got a huge, great bypass road careering past it, full of things which ought to be on the railways and making an incessant growling, snarling noise which never stops. So the peace of it, imagine the peace of this before all that came, and it would have been delightful, but one has to feel a great pain that the peace of so much of rural England has been lost.
Going back to your take on history, what would progress look like to you?
There is no such thing as progress. It's a fantasy. There is change, some changes to the better, some changes to the worse. I don't see there is any. If you hold human civilization or the human race, such as it is, under a glass for several thousand years, you will see many things get better and many things get worse. And material things may get better at the same time as what you might call spiritual and moral things get worse. And how do you decide which is more important? And whether the fact that that we have better ways of keeping our bodies clean makes up for the fact that we abort tens of thousands of babies every year.
No, these are fair points, but would you not say that, for instance, if there was a return to Christian worship and Christian values in this country, that would be progress, wouldn't it?
Well, that would depend on what form it took.
Well, your form, maybe.
No, I mean not the form of worship. I mean what form the return to it, why people return, whether they were dragooned into it by fashionable pressure, or whether it was a genuine desire to return to the.
Well, let's suppose it was a genuine retire.
Well, that would have to be good, but it wouldn't necessarily be that. I mean, part of the problem of the Victorian era was that so much it was the thing to do,
yes.
Much as reading The Guardian is the thing to do now. People were publicly religious, just as they're publicly virtuous now.
Yes.
That's not something one would particularly want to yearn for, nor would one want to yearn for those societies where religion was used as an excuse for pushing other people around.
No, and that is always a danger in a society which is outwardly religious. Look at Ireland until recent years, where the church certainly had far too much sway, and in many ways misused the power that it did, and
which is why it's now lost its
indeed,
influence for good as well.
Indeed, and then you look at our society, where the church has very little sway, but you can't think. I mean, you just referenced the abortions that happen. These are symptoms of a sick society, and a society which has lost all moral sense, as far as I can see.
Well, yes, but I mean on that we agree. So it's quite boring.
Let's go inside the church, because you have a long history with this church, don't you? I mean, this is a church well known to you.
It's a church. Well, yes, it is one of my most beloved churches in the area. It has a very special kind of peace to it.
Why is that? Why is
partly because it has really no parish, but it's a very beautiful building.
Let's go in. So, Peter, this little chapel is well known to you, isn't it?
Well, I've been here many times. It's a very good destination on a walk or a bicycle ride when you can come here. It's very good. It's one of those places where prayer has been valued. I think is the Four Quartets version, or
yes.
or the Philip Larkin church going, The Serious Place on Serious Earth.
Yes.
Where immediately you enter it, you're aware this is not an ordinary building.
No. There's 1,000 years of worship here, and somehow...
It must be coming up for, I don't know how many centuries. I'm terribly bad on this. I used to know all my Norman Early English perpendicular and decorated, but it's all gone now. This, like so many of these churches, is a merger of lots of them. It has a lovely roof.
Yeah, it does.
Though,
it does.
Particularly, it also has a beautiful, deep echo to it.
It's lovely, and the dedication to St. Margaret of Antioch. She was the She was the patron saint of pregnant women, and apparently the holy well that we just were at, that was something where ladies, pregnant women would come actually and drink the water and pray to St. Margaret, who was going to help them with difficult deliveries.
Well, an awful lot of shrines all over the world are given over to that particular preoccupation.
Now, I believe you came here and broke the law, didn't you, during COVID
we
times?
broke the law. I'm not sure the law was that specific, but I definitely did come here with a group of other people with the intention of saying a short service in a church, which had, I think, been left open by accident. We treated it with complete reverence, and also to sing some hymns, which we'd been prevented from doing, at least inside, which is a very different thing, singing hymns in the open air from singing them inside.
How many of you were there?
I think probably about half a dozen.
Were they people who were from your...
They were people I go to church with elsewhere, yes.
And so this was a sort of calculated act of defiance, but also worship?
Oh, very much so, yes. Well, worship is often defiance, isn't it? In so many countries, worship is defiance. And here we were, in of all places, England, in the 21st century, and worship had become defiance.
Yes, yes. But do you...
Nothing wrong with that either. It gives it an extra power, I think.
Did you get away with it?
Not exactly. Somebody heard, I think it was probably me, singing the particularly severe verse of praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation, may have aroused somebody nearby. I know no more of this than I can tell you. After we left, and as you know, this church is at the end of a very little used road. After we left, as we bicycled away, we encountered a police car hurrying towards the church. So I've never in my life seen the police out here before, so I could only imagine someone had called to report the singing of hymns in a church, which at that time, of course, is a very bad thing to do. But whoever was driving the police car either didn't have the wit or had the tact so they didn't stop us. And by the time they'd found the place empty and turned around, we had scattered to the four corners. I wouldn't have minded, I have to say, being caught singing hymns. It would have been quite amusing to be taken to court, people giving evidence.
That's just the sort of thing you would love to do.
I do recognise that the defendant was singing hymns, but I really didn't want to be caught for having sung hymns, so that's why we scattered.
That hymn, Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation, it's a wonderful and sort of triumphant, and it's a beefy
It's
song.
not just triumphant. There is one verse in it which is extraordinarily appropriate.
Which is?
Well, as it happens, I have brought it with me because I thought it might come up.
Oh, right.
Read it here. It's, I won't sing it.
No, let's sing it.
No, I know, let's not. So the verse, which is very seldom sung, praise to the Lord, who when darkness of sin is abounding, who when the godless do triumph, all virtue confounding, sheddeth his light, chaseth the horrors of night, saints with his mercy surrounding. There's another verse just after that, which is also, it acknowledges that Christianity exists amid a great deal of darkness and hostility. And interestingly enough, this was translated by Catherine Winkworth from the German in the 19th century, and those verses were in it. But if you find it in almost any modern hymn book, those verses, the problematic verses, which suggest that Christianity might be a bit of a struggle against hostility, have been removed. They're not sung anymore. It's a tremendous hymn.
It is a tremendous hymn, and it's one of those things that I always think about hymns, that, of course, we, in the Catholic tradition, sing many of the hymns, which are dear to Anglicans as well.
It's one of those things you've sensibly borrowed from us.
Well, some of them actually we wrote ourselves.
I don't deny it, but some of them you didn't.
Some of you didn't. But so I wanted to ask you about your Protestantism. So now, today, why Protestantism for you?
It's part of me, as is being English. I couldn't imagine myself being anything else. But it's very flexible Protestantism. A lot of Protestants would probably regard it as Catholic. No Catholic would regard it as Catholic because I'm obviously a heretic. But it's not. It's much more an identification with the the breakaway from the Church of Rome and the powers of despotism which it represented in the 16th century than anything else. I do find the era of Queen Elizabeth I to be one of the most inspiring parts of English history, and I find her to be one of the wisest and most thoughtful rulers this country has ever had. So I'm also very attached to that. And you'll notice that she was very careful not to make a huge issue out of it. She was the one who said the wisest thing which any governor of any country says, I will not make windows into men's souls.
A famous quote and a very wise one, as you say.
One of many wise things she said and did, and I identify very strongly with that. It was also, of course, an era of huge literary importance as well as historical and architectural as well. You look at anything from that time, I find it intensely moving and inspiring.
So is it the fact that, do you see then the Anglican Church as a product of an historical period, and you have been raised in it and therefore your loyalty is to it, despite the, I know that you have misgivings about some of the directions the church has taken.
Oh yes, but it's not, the church to me is not the hierarchy and the bishops and archbishops, and nor is it the general synod or any of that nonsense. The church to me is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, which is really an edited version of the Book of 1549, and the authorized version of the Bible, and the music and the architecture which accompany these things. That's what it is. And also, what is undoubtedly the case is a very large number of parish priests and ministers, we have both, because this is such a mixture of Protestants and Catholics, do immensely good work in places where nobody else will go.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. I know that to be certainly true in this city. A lot of clergy of all stripes do very good work, and
when nobody else will go there.
No,
let alone live there.
No, and it is humbling to see that, and it's also inspiring actually to see men and women dedicating themselves in that way. When you were a child, was your family upbringing was it imbued with Christianity? Was it a Christian?
No, I picked it up mainly at school, I think. There wasn't very much of it at home. I think my father had his fill of religion. My father's father was a very strict Calvinist Baptist who, to his dying day, wouldn't read fiction, for instance.
Gosh, really?
No, he regarded it as an abomination. If he wanted to read, he would read non-fiction. He would read anything, works of reference and history and philosophy, but he would not read fiction. He said, if you want to read stories, they're in the Bible. He would also, quite rightly, not have a television in the house. So he had about 9 enormous wireless sets, and or a telephone.
What did he think you couldn't be lied to on the radio?
I don't know what it was. I think he saw something in television that was
ungodly.
Yeah, I think you're dead right too. You're not.
Well, I do think that it's a mendacious and dishonest medium. I mean, I came to that view having worked in it for a few years because, you know, the truth can be so easily manipulated on television.
It's very seductive too.
It is very seductive.
It makes when they colour television, particularly when they introduced colour television, it was said that it made even the bad programs look good.
Yeah.
And it makes all kinds of drivel more acceptable and easier to absorb. And it's there, it's sitting there, and in the homes, particularly of the poor and the uneducated, it's on all the time.
Yes. And it sells to them a vision of reality which is godless and materialistic and actually so empty and shallow. It's an appalling thing which intrudes into people's lives in that way.
So my grandfather had a point about
He did.
that. He had lots of other points as well. And I wished now looking back, as one so often does with all these things, I wished I'd taken more trouble to get to know him. But
Did you know him at all?
well, no, not really. I think I knew him as a child, knows an old man, and therefore he would put on an act for us.
Yeah.
He loved putting on an act for my brother and me when we went round to his dark Edwardian house, and he would stride about. Sometimes he would actually still be getting up when we arrived. He'd stride about, shaving with a cutthroat razor in the room. He had all kinds of wonderful things. He had a mangle and an air raid shelter. And genuinely, it's the only place I've ever seen it, a picture of Lady Bountiful on the wall. It was a very old-fashioned house and thrilling, and he also had walnut trees in the garden, which had ladders permanently in them. So it was always an adventure to go there, but we never really were anything like curious enough about him. In his prime, when my father was a small boy, I think it might have been probably twice to church or twice to chapel on Sunday, and I had a sort of taste of the kind of religion that he had been given as a child. Because my uncle Ray, a lovely man with extraordinarily unworldly but a very strong spirit. I went to his funeral. His funeral was done according to strict Baptist principles, and it was so gloomy, it was funny. And I'm sure that Uncle Ray would have seen the joke, because he did have a very keen sense of humour. We were in a graveyard in Portsmouth next to the prison, the walls of which loomed overhead. The sky was black, ready to open with rain, and the ground was so soggy that the grave was held open by props in case it closed with a loud squelch. And as he was lowered to his final rest, the pastor said, "Our dear brother Raymond now goeth to his," I think that he used the word, "now goeth either to heaven or to hell. There is," he then said very forcefully, "there is no scriptural warrant for any other place." And then we sang some appalling tuneless hymns.
That's really
and went away for sausage rolls. But it was, and I thought, I don't think I could have stood that twice a day.
No, funereal
so I think my father probably felt that when he ran away to sea, as he did, to join the Navy, that he would escape all of that. So he wasn't terribly keen on putting us to it. But there's a lot of it at school.
But it's, I think as parents, which we both are, you have to be sensitive to the fact, don't you, that actually I think that very strict kind of application of religious rules to small children can be actually quite harmful, I think.
I fear so. On the other hand, there's the opposite extreme of not giving them any introduction to it at all. So
which is worse.
It's very difficult. Christianity is an extraordinarily complicated religion. And unless you encounter it as a child, it's very, very difficult to find your way around it. Yeah. So there has to be some mean between these things which you struggle to find, and it's not always easy. And even if you do it very sensibly, then you're not necessarily going to succeed given the huge pounding secular force
how did you
world.
manage it when your children got to their teenage years, which are often years when as a teenager you're beginning to find your own intellectual feet and starting to question things? I mean, were you strict about it, or did you?
Oh, Robin, I would never talk about anybody but myself. Least of all close members of my own family. But you must remember that I, as a teenager, was a complete nightmare. And I'm not joking, and I'm aware of the misery through which I put my own parents. And so you can imagine how filled with trepidation I am about how on earth to behave towards
I feel the same.
Teenagers of my own.
I feel the same about my own girls, that you never know, you don't know at the time what impact you're having. You try to do the right thing, of course, as you see it, and that's all you can do, really. You can be guided by your best instinct. But
my own parents, I think, were adrift on a sea of unknowing. I mean, but they'd been brought together by war. They didn't really know each other particularly well when they married. Both of them had quite unusual childhoods. and I'm not sure they knew how to approach it at all, and they were living in an age when the foundations of the world were slipping.
Yeah.
Everything was giving way underneath, so there was no support for them, really.
No.
I can see quite why they left a lot of it to the schools.
Do you think Christopher ever had any doubts about his loudly professed atheism?
No, I think he's one of those people who found from a very early age the idea of God, the idea of judgment, to be an oppressive nuisance, and so he rejected it. I think there are people like that. I've been like it myself, but I passed through it and came out the other side.
Did you ever talk to him about that matter?
Not really. We had a very bad debate once, which a lot of people have watched. I don't know why they watch it, because it's terrible, in which no proper issue was. He, by that time, already had a performance which he gave. Yeah. And I was trying to debate with him, and not the audience didn't want to.
What was the subject? Atheism.
It was the subject of God or not God, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Which a great disappointment to me in another way as well. There are no rapids in Grand Rapids; they've blown them up. But it was much the same with the debate. There were no rapids in the debate either. It was altogether too. We didn't really discuss the issue.
Right. I mean, he became a great intellectual showman, didn't he? What I mean by that is that he became famous for being who he was, and he became revered in certain quarters as a great intellectual.
He was a fantastic performer.
Yes.
He was a tremendous debater, and could be a really brilliant public speaker when he chose, and was, of course, a great conversationalist. And the world's television, particularly American television, there were so many more opportunities for debate, found him. And of course, in America, there's a sort of reverence for anybody who speaks in the way that we speak, and that gave an added flavour to it. He just caught this tide, and I remember going over to Grand Rapids, not having realised what had happened. I knew he had a bit of a reputation there, and they said that the debate would take place in a church, and I went to this church. It was about 20 times the size of this. It was an enormous, I think, ex-Unitarian church, holding 1,000 people. And I thought, I'd expected a sort of relatively intimate debate in which we could have joshed each other a bit and been personal and done some mutual teasing. It was impossible in this place. And also the 1,000 people who were there, they were all there for Christopher. Yeah. Do you remember the days when if you went to the cinema to watch a film, you had to watch another film first?
Yes.
Well, I was that other film. They'd been told that I was there.
They
didn't know who I was or care. I was just a nuisance. Who is this guy? Well, they never heard of me. And it's the first time I've ever been in one room with 1,000 people who hated me. They didn't hate me for any reason. They just hated me for getting in the way. They had just come there for worship purposes. And I realised at that moment, which I hadn't grasped before, that Christopher had become a rock star. It was just huge.
Yes,
I have an explanation for it, as well as the other things I've said. I mean, it happened because of his brilliance in debate and in public speaking, and his wit and his ability to entertain. But it also happened because so many young people in America, brought up in small, medium-sized towns by Christian parents, going to church each week, exposed all the time to religious teaching, were now going off to college and finding that life offered many things which their religious teaching warned them against, and they preferred to do them. And here was somebody at least as articulate and at least as educated and at least as accomplished as the people who told them all this, who could preach to them the alternative gospel, the gospel of personal sovereignty and autonomy, what I call selfism, which is what all this is really about, which has one commandment and only one, which is do what thou wilt. And that's what he was telling them. They loved it.
Do you think your brother was a wicked man?
No, absolutely not.
Do you think he did harm?
Absolutely not. Well, I've done harm myself. We all do harm.
True.
I think, I mean, under the eye of eternity, all the new atheists probably did a great deal of good, because they stimulated a new debate about religion, which seems to me to have left the cause of God stronger in the Western countries than it was before.
That's interesting. Do you think
as it happens, I do think that. I think that suddenly people confronted with clever, articulate, prominent persons, whether it be Dawkins, Dennett, or Christopher, saying that religion is bad, God is not great, whatever it is, suddenly compelled those of us on the other side to come up with counter arguments. Just as your church was strengthened by the Counter-Reformation, the Christianity in the Western world has been strengthened by counter-atheism. So you could say he did good, even from our point of view, not from his. I'm partly saying that because I know it would irritate him.
It's the old argument, isn't it, about Judas? Judas, without Judas.
It must be that offences come, but woe to him through whom offences come, however. So I'm afraid that doesn't really get him off, poor man.
No.
Not that what he wasn't very sorry.
Do you think you're because you've never been recalcitrant about explaining your faith, talking about your faith.
Reluctant, I think, is the word you're searching yes. for. I've always been recalcitrant.
Well, here you are talking about it now. Did Christopher's atheism, in a way, stimulate you to a new understanding of faith?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, undoubtedly. If you have someone like that in your life all the time, this has been went on for pretty much 60 years, when we were both slightly less than that, when we were both alive and conscious of each other, and endlessly stimulating having a brother, such an enormous piece of good fortune.
Do you think there's any truth in this thing? I know we've talked about this before, you and I, but this chap who travelled with Christopher in his final years, and he was doing a lecture tour, wasn't he, around the Midwest?
Yes.
And then he wrote this book, this sort of memoir of
yes,
he and Christopher on the road.
Silly thing.
Suggesting that Christopher had actually had some doubts about his atheism. What do you make of that?
I think you know what happens to people when they write books and publishers come back and say, do you think you could brighten this up a bit? I think he overdid it. I think, of course, Christopher was not dismissive of religious persons. He enjoyed the company. My friend Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, is the Ayatollah of Idaho, this tremendous Calvinist preacher and general, what can I say? The word propagandist would probably be misunderstood. Apologist for proper old-fashioned Protestant American religion. They got on enormously well. They travelled together, but I don't think Doug would ever have said that he thought Christopher was on the verge of coming to Jesus. They were happy to agree on the fact that P.G. Woodhouse was a brilliant author, which they both did. But you can see their conversations. No, I think Larry Taunton is the name of the guy.
Yes,
I think I talked to him a lot, and I just thought that he just overdid it. I think he had a very good story, which was probably unwelcome to a lot of Christopher's more militant fans, that he was more thoughtful about the issue than they perhaps imagined.
Yeah.
But that's so far from him being someone on the verge of crossing the Jordan. I don't think he was. And I think by the time he reached the end of his life and was very ill, the idea of saying, "Oh well, now I'm ill and on the brink of death, I'm going to suddenly embrace religion," would have seemed to him to be a terrible act of cowardice, which he wouldn't conceivably have undertaken. Because whatever else you may say about him, you certainly can't say he was a coward.
No, he was a brave polemicist and actually did things like when, for instance, he came out in favour of the Iraq war. That was something which dismayed and perplexed his many fans.
He had the physical courage as well. You may remember the occasion when he agreed to be waterboarded because people told him it wasn't torture. And so he arranged, and they waterboarded him. He had to sign a document saying, "Too bad if we kill you." And he kind of said, "If it isn't torture, I don't know what is." That took some guts, and the Salman Rushdie business also likewise. I mean, he exposed himself on that. So no, I think even if there'd been a tiny, which I don't think there was, had there been a tiny flickering candle of doubt in his mind at that stage in his life, he would have resisted it, precisely because I think he would have thought that if there is a God, God would prefer to welcome a brave man than a coward.
Interesting. And who knows, I mean, who can say what goes through anyone's mind in those last moments of life?
Quite.
None of us can know that. But
Though the last words are very odd.
which were?
I can't remember. Something like class struggles. I can't remember what they are. They were very Marxist-Leninists. I wasn't there, so I can't. I
just want to.
I was there a few days before, but I wasn't there at the actual end. Why don't you come all the way up?
Oh well.
You are allowed.
Okay. If you think I should.
I do. We're inclusive.
I think we should sing a verse of that rousing hymn.
Well, I think singing might be too much for the audience, but do you know the collect for the first Sunday in Advent?
No.
You probably have it.
What is it?
Almighty God, give us grace at this time to cast away the works of darkness and put upon us the armour of light, now in the time of this mortal life in which thy Son Jesus Christ came to visit us in great humility, that in the last day, when he shall come again in his glorious majesty to judge both the quick and the dead, we may rise to the life immortal. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee and the Holy Ghost, world without end.
Amen.
Amen.
So Peter, here we are in more relaxed surroundings, so your good health. You said something back in the chapel there, and you were talking about the way in which the new atheism, if you like, had stimulated a counter response from those who still believe. And just tell me, do you think that the situation of Christians and belief in Britain now, what's your overall impression of the health, if you like, of religion in Britain?
Oh, terrible. It has never been so weak in more than 1,000 years, I think.
But those who do believe maybe are being forced into a more profound understanding?
Well, several things have happened. One, there is now a quite substantial rival to Christianity in the form of Islam, which now has a really quite serious presence in this country. And in the simple act of identifying themselves as not being the same as Muslims, Christians have an interesting time working out what it is they believe and what they don't believe. It's itself a stimulus, seems to me, not necessarily a bad thing. And also the attacks of the new atheists. The real peril for religion is indifference.
Yes.
And that grows immensely all the time. Indifference, utter lack of interest, dismissal.
What do you see in your own personal contacts in religion, in a religious sense, in your home life in this city? Do you see young people? I mean, what is the state of religion amongst young people, do you think?
I have no idea. Oxford is not like anywhere else. It's why I live here, precisely because it's not. You couldn't gain any real understanding of anything elsewhere in the world from Oxford. There are undoubtedly some people under 30 who are interested in religion. Interestingly, I do hear from time to time that they tend to be interested in its more traditional aspect and in a more traditional approach to it than the one which the churches have often believed to be wise. And you find the churches tend to patronize the young by baby talk scripture and baby talk prayers and infantile songs instead of proper hymns. Great. And I think that's probably put a lot of people off. I've no doubt it brings some people in. Some people do like that sort of stuff. But I think there are other people who want something both serious and different from daily life, who are much more attracted by mystery and poetry and beauty than by being talked down to. Some of that, but there's still millions and millions of people who have absolutely no idea who Jesus Christ is, and no interest in finding out. And how on earth you would reach them in a society where they haven't even been brought up to believe it was important, I don't know.
Do you think all is lost then?
Well, no, all is not lost under the eye of eternity. In eternity, nothing is lost. But in temporal terms, what was a formerly highly Christian country in culture, law, and to some extent behaviour is no longer one. And I don't think that's going to come back.
Does the rise, the presence, strong presence of Islam in Britain now, does that worry you?
Well, I think one of the things that you have to do if you take a serious view of Christianity is to say it's not your job to worry about it. Your job is to make the best of it. If people have come to live in this country, then they are now our neighbours, and therefore we are subject to the law. We have to love our neighbours, and I'm suspicious of and worried by what I think is, and don't press me too hard on this because I don't want to name names, I think is an attempt to use a hostility towards Islam as an excuse for a certain rather nasty type of populism. And I don't think any Christian person can engage in any act which would encourage that sort of behaviour. I think if you don't like the precepts of Islam, and there are some of them that I don't like, particularly its attitude towards women, then argue it. I find when I argue with Muslims, they welcome it.
Mm. In fact, it's a funny thing, isn't it? And that actually many of the underlying values of Islam, the things which it values, these are quite, one might say, socially conservative values, and actually there are issues on which Muslims and Christians could properly make common cause.
Up to a point.
Up to a point.
Up to a point. I mean, I recently had the experience, I did this bizarre series where we pretended to be in prison with quite a large number of former prisoners on a television program, and one of my cellmates was himself a man who had been involved in quite serious crime and had become, since that, or partly since being very nearly killed in a stabbing, had become a very serious Muslim, and we found ourselves late at night in the same cell praying side by side, him in Islamic prayers and I in Christian ones. And I think it was perfectly possible we could walk along the same path pretty much arm in arm for a lot of the way, but there would be moments where we would part. I thought that the important bit was the bit where we could walk together rather than the bit where we could walk apart. But it doesn't mean that I drop my objections to the parts of Islam that don't appeal to me, or which I
no, absolutely.
Well, that's not the point. I'm an inclusivist to the point of believing generally in the goodness of others where possible, but not naive in believing in the goodness of others where it plainly isn't, or in accepting things which I profoundly disagree with. But I think there are ways of getting along, and we'll have to find them. But it'd be a lot easier to get along, it seems to me, if Christianity were a little bit more muscular.
Do you think we worship the same God?
I believe so. They certainly say so. You know, I was born in Malta, where now in your church the vernacular services are conducted in Maltese, which is a form of Arabic, and God is addressed as Allah in Roman Catholic churches. So I think it probably is the same God. Certainly that's what Muslims believe, and I'm not going to argue with them about that.
Do you see any change in the underlying landscape of the interface between politics and religion in this country? I mean, it seems to me that we have lived through a hyper-liberal period, a period when
liberal ideas have vanquished all else, and we're now it's difficult to see how the liberal revolution can go much further than it has already done.
I know.
So where do we go
Well,
next?
I don't agree with you there. I think that liberal it's an American term which has its uses, but I think it runs out of road about here. This is not really liberal. This is a huge cultural, social, and social
Give me a better term.
revolution. Well, technically, you could call it Gramscian cultural revolution, or you could call it what it is in terms of its political current, Eurocommunism. It's an extremely revolutionary movement, but it's no longer directed towards nationalising ice cream stands or indeed running a secret police. It's directed towards changing the human race in other ways through culture and morals. It's particularly hostile to the married family, and it's particularly hostile to the canons of literature, history, music, which have up until now shaped us. And it wants a wholly different world. It has economic preoccupations as well, but they're not the ones that old-fashioned communists have. They're more modern ones to do with green politics and net zero. But it is very profound. And the reason why we can't call it liberal anymore is there really is nothing liberal about the next phase. The next phase involves the imposition of its ideas on people, whether they like it or not. It doesn't need secret police as well, because it's developed these very powerful speech codes which prevent large numbers of things from being said or thought. And it's also learnt that naked persecution is a mistake. If you throw people into prison for saying things, then you become unpopular. But if you merely make sure they lose their jobs or become unpersons on social media, then that's okay. People will put up with that. Amnesty International's not going to intervene because somebody lost a local authority job for saying the wrong thing. And so it's got a lot further to go. I don't think it's by any means right. You're sort of thinking that the tide, just the long withdrawing roar of Christianity, the tide is now turning and it's going to start beginning to roar back in again. I don't think so.
So what is the look at, in your view, for Christian believers in this country?
Internal exile, really. We have to grow accustomed to the fact, which is both undeniable and probably impossible to oppose in any way, that Christianity is no longer the dominant thought system of the country. It ceased legally to be when the Equality Act was passed in 2010, and the Christian religion became one of many religions and has no longer has any privileges in our society, legal or social. It's as I say, it's just one of many. So that all the things which used to be, if you look at any Victorian court building, civil or criminal, it will be adorned with figures of Christ or Moses. It will have religious text. You go to the Old Bailey, it's got quotations from the Psalms on the walls. It was specifically overtly Christian. That is all gone now, and you will find judges who will openly say it. So the law has gone. The primacy of the church, it's quite interesting that the coronation took place sort of as a Christian ceremony, but it was much less so than the 1953 counterpart. And in the parts of the country where the churches, as it were, less established, in Scotland, the ceremonies which took place were again less Christian and more open to other faiths. So that's gone. There's no point in pretending that it hasn't gone, and I doubt very much whether any action that you or I or anybody else could take, up to and including the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, would make any difference to that. So you don't lose battles by pretending you've won them. You don't win battles by pretending you've won them. Sometimes you have to admit you've lost a battle to recover any ground at all afterwards, and I think we have to admit we've lost that one. I'd say some form of internal exile in which the practice and pursuit of Christianity is, I won't say private, but certainly less public than it has been, and less part of the operations of life in the state and in commerce. We have to get used to being, as I say, exiles within our own country.
Where do you see Eurocommunism, or this Gramscian revolution that you're talking about, where do you think its weak spots are?
Well, its weak spots are that the consequences of it are very bad, but the strength of it is that what it destroys, it generally destroys so thoroughly that by the time it's realised it's been destroyed, it has no possibility of recovery. When the long march of the institutions through the institutions goes to an institution, at the end of it there is nobody left standing who supports the way the institution used to be. It's now, the other thing is it doesn't destroy outward aspects. All the buildings are left standing. Often the buildings look better than they did before, but they don't contain the ideas or the purposes they used to contain. Look at the Houses of Parliament. Once they've finished their renovation, they'll look absolutely splendid, but they will not be the Parliament that it was before.
How many Christians do you think in this country are clear-sighted about these things you're talking of? I mean, I think there's a sort of, in a way, there's a lingering there are the remnants, actually, of a Christian society still, and these perhaps can mislead us into thinking that things have not changed so very much.
Quite so. That's it. That's what they do,
Yes.
and the revolutionaries aren't bothered about that.
No.
And some of the less intelligent revolutionaries may grind their teeth at the fact there's still a overtly religious thought for the day on the Radio 4 Today programme. The cleverer ones realise that almost every item on the Today programme is a thought for the day for atheism, and having 5 minutes reserved for Christianity, which is often expounded by, or not even Christianity, religion, which is often expanded by the Reverend J.C. Flannel in a way designed to make religion look foolish, is not really a huge survival. And people go on about the bishops being in the House of Lords. Well, they may well be in the House of Lords, but in what way do they stand in the House of Lords for the Christian religion or belief in God? They're just largely an adjunct to the generally left-wing crossbenchers in the House of Lords. They don't. The idea that somehow or other having bishops in the House of Lords makes this a Christian country is so funny.
Yes.
That I don't really know where to begin.
Yeah. No, well, I couldn't agree with you more on that. Well, as often with you, Peter, I come away from having talked with you challenged and also not necessarily terribly optimistic about the future, because your view of things is one of continuing decline, which dismays me, and one I don't wholly subscribe to myself.
Well, we have a perfect instance of this here. You have a glass in front of you. What would you say it was, half full or half empty?
Very good. Your health.
It's obviously half empty, and it would not be half full unless it was being filled from the tap with some more of whatever it contains. And that is why you need pessimists, because who else is going to buy the next round?
Well, you certainly are one of our generation's leading pessimists.
Well, it's being pessimistic that keeps me so cheerful.
Thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed watching this interview, and I hope you have, and you'd like to see more of this kind of work, you might care to consider making a small donation. If you go to our website, newhumanum.org, and follow the links, you'll find a donation page. Anything you can give us would be gratefully received.